I was adjusting my pearl earrings in the vestibule mirror when I heard the wedding coordinator calling out names for the processional. Miguel Rodriguez, groom. Jessica Walsh, bride. Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, parents of the groom. The list went on, each name echoing through St. Catherine's Cathedral like a roll call of everyone who mattered. Everyone except me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Standing there in my lavender bridesmaid dress, I felt invisible. Not metaphorically invisible, but actually transparent, like I could dissolve into the marble floor, and no one would notice. The coordinator's voice continued, introducing cousins I barely knew, college friends Miguel had met last semester, even Jessica's hairdresser who apparently rated a mention. But Elena Rodriguez, Miguel's sister for 24 years, the person who taught him to ride a bike and covered for him when he snuck out in high school, silence. My mother rushed past me, smoothing her navy dress and checking her lipstick. She paused when she saw my face. "Mija, why do you look like someone died? This is your brother's wedding day." I opened my mouth to explain, but she was already gone, hurrying to take her place in the procession. The coordinator's voice grew louder as she moved down the line, each introduction accompanied by polite applause from the gathered guests inside the cathedral. "And now, the wedding party," she announced, her voice carrying that practiced cheerfulness of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. I stepped forward, finally ready to hear my name, to take my place as Miguel's sister, as someone who belonged in this family tableau. But she sailed right past me to Jessica's younger sister, then her college roommate, then 2 girls I'd never seen before in my life. The coordinator's eyes swept over me like I was part of the architecture, just another pillar holding up the building. I felt my chest tighten, that familiar sensation of being erased from my own family's story. It wasn't the first time. At Miguel's graduation, they'd called up everyone for photos except me. At his engagement party, I'd helped serve the food while Jessica's family gave speeches about welcoming him into their lives. I was always the helper, never the honored. Always essential behind the scenes, never worthy of recognition in the spotlight. The music began, that traditional wedding march that signals the beginning of something sacred and irreversible. I watched from the sidelines as the procession moved into the cathedral, a river of silk and flowers and carefully choreographed joy. Miguel looked handsome in his black tuxedo, beaming as he took his place at the altar. Jessica floated down the aisle like something from a fairy tale, her train spreading behind her like spilled moonlight. Father Morrison's voice filled the cathedral as he began the ceremony. I slipped into a back pew, behind visiting relatives I didn't recognize, and tried to focus on the beauty of the moment instead of the hollow ache in my chest. The cathedral was magnificent, with its soaring ceilings and stained glass windows casting colored light across the congregation. Hundreds of candles flickered on the altar, and the air smelled of lilies and incense. As Father Morrison spoke about love and commitment, about families joining together, I couldn't help but wonder where I fit in this new configuration. Miguel and Jessica would move to San Francisco after their honeymoon, start their own traditions, build their own life. Our parents would visit them, probably more often than they visited me. I would become an afterthought, a holiday obligation, someone they called when they needed a favor or remembered to feel guilty about forgetting me. The ceremony continued with readings about love being patient and kind, about 2 becoming 1. I listened to the familiar words, but they felt distant, like they were meant for other people, people who belonged somewhere, people who mattered enough to be introduced at their own brother's wedding. When the congregation stood for the unity candle lighting, I remained seated, feeling separated from the ritual by more than just physical distance. Then something extraordinary happened. As Father Morrison was beginning the blessing of the rings, a door at the side of the cathedral opened quietly. A figure in simple black robes entered, moving with the unhurried grace of someone accustomed to sacred spaces. It took me a moment to realize who it was, and when I did, my breath caught in my throat. Pope Francis himself had entered our small family wedding in Riverside, California. The congregation began to murmur and turn, but the Pope raised a gentle hand for silence. He moved toward the altar with that characteristic humility that had made him beloved worldwide. But there was something purposeful in his step, like he was looking for someone specific. Father Morrison looked stunned but stepped aside respectfully as the Pope approached the microphone. "Forgive the interruption," the Pope said in his accented English, his voice carrying easily through the cathedral's sound system. "I am looking for someone. I have traveled here today because I received word that the Cardinal was in attendance." He paused, his eyes scanning the congregation with the intensity of someone on a sacred mission. "Would the Cardinal please stand?" The silence that followed was absolute. 500 people held their breath as one, all eyes searching the pews for whoever this mysterious Cardinal might be. I felt my heart pounding against my ribs, confused and terrified and somehow electrified all at once. There was no Cardinal here, just families and friends gathered for Miguel and Jessica's wedding. The Pope must have made some kind of mistake. But then his eyes found mine across the crowded cathedral. Those kind, weathered eyes that had looked upon suffering and joy in equal measure, that had blessed world leaders and street children with the same gentle grace. He was looking directly at me, and somehow, impossibly, he was smiling. "There," he said softly, but his voice carried to every corner of the cathedral. "The one in the back pew, in the lavender dress. Would you please come forward?" The entire congregation turned to stare at me. Miguel's mouth had fallen open. Jessica looked confused but curious. My parents appeared to be in shock. I sat frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to comprehend what was happening. This had to be a mistake. I was nobody special, just Elena Rodriguez, the overlooked sister, the invisible daughter, the woman who helped but never belonged. "Please," the Pope said again, his voice gentle but insistent. "I have come a very long way to meet you." My legs felt like water as I stood. The walk down that center aisle felt endless, every eye in the cathedral following my movement. I could hear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Whispers starting, families trying to understand who I was, why the Pope himself had interrupted a wedding to speak with me. My parents looked like they'd seen a ghost. Miguel kept shaking his head in disbelief. When I reached the altar, the Pope stepped down to meet me, taking my hands in his with the tenderness of a grandfather greeting a beloved grandchild. "Elena Rodriguez," he said, and the fact that he knew my name sent a shiver through the entire assembly. "I've been hoping to meet you for many months." I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Your Holiness, I think there's been some mistake. I'm not a cardinal. I'm nobody." His eyes crinkled with something that might have been amusement. "My dear child, you are far from nobody. You are the cardinal we have been seeking. Tell me, do you still have your grandmother's prayer book? The one with the illuminated letters you restored when you were 17? The world tilted. How could he possibly know about that? My grandmother's ancient prayer book had been falling apart, its hand-lettered pages crumbling, its gold leaf illustrations fading. I'd spent an entire summer teaching myself restoration techniques from library books, painstakingly repairing each page with tools I'd bought with money from my part-time job. It had been a labor of love, done in secret, because I was afraid someone would tell me I was ruining a family heirloom. Yes, I stammered. But how do you... That prayer book, the Pope continued, his voice now addressing the entire congregation, contains some of the finest illuminated manuscript work I have ever seen. Not the original, which was beautiful, but the restoration, Elena's work. He turned back to me. When your family donated it to the church archive 3 years ago, it made its way to our Vatican library. Our most expert manuscript scholars examined it, and they declared the restoration work to be extraordinary. They said whoever had done this work possessed a gift that appears perhaps once in a generation. I felt dizzy. My family had donated grandmother's prayer book? Without telling me? Without even mentioning that they still had it after all these years? I looked toward my parents, who appeared as shocked as I felt. Miguel was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. We have been searching for the Cardinal, which is what our scholars nickname the unknown artist who created this masterpiece of restoration. The precision of the gold leaf application, the seamless repair of the parchment, the way you matched inks that were created centuries ago, it is the work of someone touched by divine inspiration. The cathedral had gone so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. The Pope's words were washing over me like waves, each one reshaping my understanding of myself, of my place in the world. All those hours I'd spent in my tiny apartment, hunched over ancient texts I'd found in estate sales and thrift stores, teaching myself the lost arts of manuscript restoration, I thought it was just a hobby, just something I did because I loved the feel of old paper and the challenge of bringing faded beauty back to life. Elena, the Pope said, his voice now soft enough that only I could hear, we would like to invite you to Rome. The Vatican Library has hundreds of manuscripts in desperate need of restoration, works that have been waiting decades for someone with your particular skills. Would you consider joining our team? Behind me, I heard Jessica's mother whisper, "Who is this girl?" I almost laughed. I was the girl who had been invisible 5 minutes ago, the sister who didn't rate an introduction at her own wedding brother. I was the daughter my parents forgot to mention when people asked about their children. I was the woman who had spent her life believing she had nothing special to offer the world. But standing there in the colored light streaming through stained glass windows, with the Pope's gentle hands still holding mine, I felt something awakening inside me. A recognition, not just of my skills, but of my worth. For the first time in my life, someone wasn't just seeing me, they were seeking me out. They had crossed an ocean to find me. I started, then stopped. The words I needed didn't exist yet. How do you respond when your entire understanding of yourself changes in a single moment? How do you say yes to a life you never dared to imagine? The Pope smiled, understanding my silence. You don't need to answer today, but know this. What you have is not just a skill. It is a calling, and the world needs what you can give. He released my hands and stepped back, addressing the congregation once more. Please continue with this beautiful celebration. I apologize for the interruption, but some meetings cannot wait for convenient timing. He nodded to Father Morrison, who still looked shock-shelled, and walked back toward the side door as quietly as he had entered. But before he left, he paused and looked back at me one final time. Elena Rodriguez, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral. The Cardinal has been found. And then he was gone, leaving behind a cathedral full of people staring at me with new eyes, leaving behind a bride and groom whose wedding had just become legendary, leaving behind a woman who had spent 24 years believing she was invisible and had just discovered she was exactly who the world had been looking for. Miguel and Jessica's wedding continued, but everything had changed. As I walked back to my pew, no longer the forgotten sister, but the Cardinal the Pope had sought, I felt the weight of possibility settling on my shoulders. The ceremony concluded with vows and rings and the traditional kiss, but I barely heard any of it. My mind was reeling with questions and dreams I'd never allowed myself to have. During the reception, I was surrounded by people I'd known my entire life, but who suddenly seemed to be seeing me for the first time. Relatives who had never shown interest in my life were asking about my artwork. Family friends were treating me with a respect I'd never experienced. Miguel pulled me aside during the dinner, his eyes bright with wonder and something that might have been pride. Elena, I had no idea. All those times I saw you working on old books in your room, I thought you were just, I don't know, reading or something. I never realized you were creating art. I looked at my brother, this person I'd loved and protected and supported for my entire life, and saw genuine awe in his expression. I never thought it was important enough to mention, I said honestly. Important enough? Miguel shook his head. The Pope just interrupted my wedding to find you. I think that qualifies as important. As the evening wound down and the last guests filtered out of the reception hall, I found myself standing alone on the terrace, looking out over the lights of Riverside. The night air was cool against my skin.
Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of mission bells chiming the hour. My phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. When I opened it, my breath caught.
It was from the Vatican's official office, containing travel information and an invitation letter. They were serious. This wasn't just a moment of inspiration from the Pope. This was a genuine offer to join one of the most prestigious art restoration teams in the world. I thought about my life as it had been that morning. My small apartment filled with books and art supplies that no one understood. My job at the local museum where I cataloged artifacts but never got to do the restoration work I dreamed of. My family, who loved me but never quite saw me. All of it felt like a costume I'd been wearing, waiting for someone to recognize the person underneath. The person underneath was the Cardinal, the person the Pope had traveled across the world to find, the person whose work had impressed Vatican scholars, whose skills were needed to preserve centuries of sacred art and knowledge. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't forgotten. I wasn't the overlooked sister or the helpful daughter or the quiet woman in the background. I was exactly who I was supposed to be, and the world had finally found me. Standing there under the California stars, still wearing my lavender bridesmaid dress, I whispered a prayer of gratitude to my grandmother, whose ancient prayer book had started this journey. Tomorrow, I would begin planning for Rome. Tomorrow, I would start becoming the Cardinal, in truth, not just in name. But tonight, I was simply Elena Rodriguez, the woman who had been invisible at her brother's wedding until the Pope asked for her by name. And that was more than enough. The week following Miguel's wedding felt like living in someone else's life. Word had spread through Riverside faster than wildfire in August, carried by wedding guests who couldn't stop talking about the night the Pope interrupted a ceremony to find a local manuscript restorer. My phone rang constantly, with reporters wanting interviews, art collectors asking about my work, and distant relatives suddenly remembering my existence. My mother sat at our kitchen table Tuesday morning, surrounded by newspaper clippings and printouts of social media posts about the wedding. "Mija, look at this," she said, sliding a tablet across the Formaga surface. "Channel 7 wants to do a feature story. The Los Angeles Times called 3 times yesterday." Her voice carried a mixture of pride and bewilderment, like she was still trying to understand how her quiet daughter had become front-page news. My father stood by the coffee maker, shaking his head in amazement. "Elena, I found your grandmother's prayer book in the attic last week while looking for Christmas decorations. I had no idea when we donated it that you were the one who fixed it. Your mother and I thought some professional had restored it years ago." He paused, looking genuinely remorseful. "We should have asked you about it." The strangest part wasn't the media attention or the family's newfound interest in my work. It was the way people in town looked at me now when I walked down the street. Mrs. Hernandez from the corner market, who had barely acknowledged me for 15 years, stopped me to ask about my art techniques. The barista at the coffee shop I visited daily suddenly knew my name and wanted to hear about the Vatican invitation. But beneath all the excitement and congratulations, I felt a growing pressure that sat heavy in my chest like a stone. Everyone expected me to accept the Vatican's offer immediately, to pack my bags and fly to Rome like this was some romantic movie where everything worked out perfectly. They didn't understand that leaving everything I'd ever known, even for the opportunity of a lifetime, felt terrifying. Thursday evening, I drove to the old Mission Santa Clara on the outskirts of town, seeking the quiet I couldn't find anywhere else. The mission had been abandoned for decades, its adobe walls crumbling and its gardens overgrown, but there was something peaceful about the decay. I parked on the gravel road and walked through the rusted gates, past wild roses that had climbed over everything in sight. The chapel doors were locked, but I could see through the broken windows into the sanctuary where shafts of evening light illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. The silence here felt different from the silence of my apartment or the awkward quiet that descended when people didn't know how to talk to the newly famous Elena Rodriguez. This was the silence of sacred spaces, thick with the weight of centuries of prayers. I sat on the stone steps of the chapel and pulled out the leather portfolio that I'd brought with me. Inside were photographs of some of my restoration work, pieces I'd completed over the years without ever thinking they were good enough to show anyone. A 15th century book of hours I'd found at an estate sale, its pages water damaged and its binding split.
a collection of medieval psalms written on vellum so delicate it cracked if you breathed on it wrong, a hand-illuminated Bible from the 1600s that someone had stored in their garage for 30 years. Looking at the photographs now, seeing my work through the Pope's eyes rather than my own critical gaze, I began to understand what had impressed the Vatican scholars. Each restoration told a story of patience and reverence, of hours spent learning how medieval scribes mixed their inks, how they prepared their surfaces, how they thought about the relationship between text and image. I hadn't just repaired these manuscripts, I had entered into conversation with artists that had been dead for centuries. As darkness settled over the mission grounds, I heard footsteps on the gravel path. A figure emerged from the shadows, an elderly man in simple brown robes, walking with the measured pace of someone who spent a lot of time in contemplation. He approached slowly, giving me time to decide whether I wanted company. "Good evening," he said when he reached the chapel steps. His voice was gentle, with the slight accent of someone who had learned English as a second language. "I hope I'm not intruding. I come here sometimes to think, and I noticed your car." I gestured to the empty space beside me on the steps. "Please, sit if you'd like. I was just enjoying the quiet." He settled beside me with the careful movements of advanced age. "I am Father Augustine," he said. "I was assigned to this mission 40 years ago, before they decided it was too expensive to maintain. I still live in the rectory down the road and keep an eye on the place." "I'm Elena Rodriguez." Then I waited to see if recognition would flicker across his face. It didn't. Either he hadn't heard about the wedding incident, or he was too polite to make a fuss about it. "Are you an artist?" he asked, nodding towards the portfolio in my lap. "I see you looking at photographs of illuminated
Manuscripts. I restore them, I said. Old religious texts, mostly. Things that are falling apart. I paused, then added, "The Vatican has invited me to work for them." Father Augustine was quiet for a long moment, studying the crumbling facade of the chapel. "And you are uncertain whether to accept?" "Everyone thinks I'm crazy for hesitating," I admitted. "It's the opportunity of a lifetime. But I've never lived anywhere but Riverside. I don't speak Italian. I don't know anything about working for the church in any official capacity." I gestured helplessly. "What if I get there and they realize I'm not as good as they think I am?" "May I see your work?" he asked. I opened the portfolio and began showing him the photographs, explaining each piece and the challenges I'd faced in restoring it. Father Augustine listened with the attention of someone who understood both the technical and spiritual aspects of what I was describing. When I finished, he was quiet for another long moment. "Elena," he said finally, "do you know why illuminated manuscripts were created?" I thought about the question. "To preserve religious texts, to make them beautiful for worship." "That's part of it," he agreed. "But there's something deeper. These artists weren't just copying text or creating decoration. They were praying with their hands. Every letter, every flourish, every touch of gold leaf was an act of devotion. When you restore their work, you're not just preserving paper and ink. You're participating in their prayer." His words hit something deep inside me, a truth I'd felt but never been able to articulate. I never thought of it that way. "The Vatican scholars recognize this in your work," Father Augustine continued. "They saw that you approach these manuscripts not as historical artifacts, but as living prayers that deserve to continue speaking. That's a rare gift, and it's exactly what the church needs right now." We sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of cars on the highway, the ordinary world continuing its business while I wrestled with a decision that would change everything. "What if I fail?" I asked quietly. Father Augustine smiled. "What if you succeed beyond your wildest dreams? What if God has been preparing you for this work your entire life, and running away from it would be the real failure?" His words followed me home that night and stayed with me through a restless sleep. The next morning, I called the Vatican number on the official letter and spoke with someone named Cardinal Bertoli, who explained the details of their offer.
They would provide housing, a generous salary, access to the most advanced restoration facilities in the world, and the opportunity to work with manuscripts that scholars had only dreamed of touching. "We understand this is a significant decision," Cardinal Bertoli said in careful English. "We don't need an answer immediately, but I will tell you that His Holiness was quite insistent that we make every effort to bring you to Rome. He believes your work could help preserve treasures that might otherwise be lost forever." After hanging up, I drove back to the mission. Father Augustine was tending to a small garden behind the rectory, coaxing vegetables from the California soil with the same patience I applied to damaged parchment. When he saw me, he straightened and wiped his hands on a towel. "I want to accept their offer," I said without preamble, "but I don't know how to leave everything I know." "Who says you have to leave it forever?" he asked. "Maybe this isn't about abandoning your old life. Maybe it's about expanding it." That afternoon, I called my parents and asked them to meet me at the mission. They arrived looking curious and slightly worried, probably wondering why their newly famous daughter wanted to have a serious conversation in a place that looked like it might collapse in the next strong wind. I led them to the chapel steps where Father Augustine and I had talked. "I want to show you something," I said, opening my portfolio again. This time, I didn't just show them the photographs. I told them the stories behind each piece, explained what I'd learned from working with centuries-old techniques, shared the joy I felt when a faded image suddenly came back to life under my careful touch. My mother listened with tears in her eyes. "Mija, I had no idea you felt so passionate about this work. You always seemed so quiet about it, like it was just a hobby." "I was quiet because I didn't think anyone would understand," I said honestly. "I didn't think it was important enough to talk about." My father reached over and took my hand. "Elena, your work is beautiful, more than beautiful. It's sacred. If the Vatican wants you, you should go, but know that you'll always have a home here." The next week passed in a blur of preparations and goodbyes. I gave notice at the museum, where my supervisor admitted she'd been hoping to promote me to head of conservation, but understood that Rome offered opportunities they couldn't match. I put my apartment up for sublease, packed my essential restoration tools, and said goodbye to friends who promised to visit me in Italy. Miguel and Jessica, back from their honeymoon, took me to dinner at our favorite Mexican restaurant downtown. "I can't believe the Pope crashed our wedding to find my sister," Miguel said, shaking his head in amazement. "Jessica's family is convinced we planned the whole thing." "I keep thinking about all the times I complained that you were too quiet, too focused on your books. I'm sorry, Elena, I never understood what you were doing." "None of us did," I replied. "Sometimes, including me." The hardest goodbye was Father Augustine. I found him in his garden again, this time working by lamplight in the cool evening air. When I told him about my decision to accept the Vatican position, he smiled like he'd known all along what I would choose. "This mission has been empty for 40 years, he said, gesturing toward the abandoned chapel. "But perhaps someday, when you return with all your new knowledge and skills, we might find a way to bring it back to life. There are manuscripts in our archives that have been waiting for someone like you." The morning I left for Rome, my entire family gathered at LAX to see me off. My mother cried and made me promise to call every day. My father gave me a wooden cross that had belonged to my grandfather, a reminder of where I came from. Miguel hugged me tight and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Elena. I always have been, even when I didn't know how to show it." As the plane lifted off from Los Angeles, I pressed my face to the window and watched California disappear beneath the clouds. I was leaving behind everything familiar, everyone I loved, every place that had shaped me into the person I was. But I was also flying towards something I'd never dared to imagine, a life where my deepest passion was my profession, where my quiet dedication to
preserving beauty would be valued and supported, where I could spend my days in conversation with artists who had lived centuries before me.
Somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, as I dozed in my window seat with Father Augustine's words echoing in my mind, I realized that this wasn't really about leaving my old life behind. It was about discovering who I'd always been meant to become. The Elena Rodriguez who had spent her life feeling invisible was still part of me, but she was no longer the whole story. I was flying toward Rome as the Cardinal, the manuscript restorer the Pope himself had sought out. But more than that, I was finally becoming the person who had been hiding inside me all along, waiting for the world to recognize what I had to offer. And for the first time in my life, I couldn't wait to see what tomorrow would bring. The plane crossed into European airspace as dawn broke over the continent below, painting the clouds in shades of gold and rose that reminded me of the illuminated letters I'd spent so many hours bringing back to life. I pulled out my notebook and began sketching ideas for my first project in Rome, my hands already itching to get back to work. This wasn't just a new job or a new country. This was the beginning of the life I was meant to live. Rome in October was nothing like the pictures in travel magazines. The ancient city breathes with a rhythm that seemed to pulse through the cobblestones themselves, carrying the weight of empires and saints, artists and pilgrims who had walked these same streets for millennia. When my taxi pulled up to the Vatican gates, I pressed my face to the window like a child seeing the ocean for the first time, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of where I was about to spend the next chapter of my life. The Vatican Museum's restoration department occupied an entire wing of buildings that most tourists never saw, hidden behind the public galleries and connected by corridors that seemed to stretch for miles. Cardinal Bertoli met me at the entrance, a man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that sparkled with intelligence behind wire-rimmed glasses. He spoke English with the precision of someone who had spent years in diplomatic service, but his warmth was immediately apparent. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said, extending his hand with genuine pleasure. "Welcome to Rome. His Holiness asked me to convey his personal greetings and to assure you that we are delighted to have you join our team." He gestured toward the imposing doors behind him. "Shall we begin your orientation? I think you'll find our facilities quite remarkable." Walking through those corridors for the first time felt like entering a secret world. We passed laboratories equipped with microscopes that could examine individual fibers of parchment, climate-controlled storage rooms where manuscripts rested in custom-designed cases, and workshops where conservators bent over ancient texts with tools that looked like they belonged in a surgeon's operating room. The air hummed with the quiet intensity of people doing work they considered sacred. "Our collection includes approximately 80,000 manuscripts," Cardinal Bertoli explained as we walked. "Some date back to the 2nd century. Many have never been properly catalogued, let alone restored. We have pieces that scholars have dreamed of studying for decades, but they're too fragile to handle without proper conservation." He stopped in front of a heavy wooden door marked with signs in Latin, Italian, and English warning about restricted access. "This is where you'll be working," he said, producing an ornate key from his robes. "The Manuscript Conservation Laboratory. Dr. Francesca Moretti, our head conservator, is waiting to meet you." The laboratory took my breath away. Tall windows faced north, providing the perfect light for detailed work, while modern LED lamps could be adjusted to any spectrum needed for accurate color assessment. Work tables stretched across the room, each equipped with magnifying lenses, precise measuring tools, and storage for an array of brushes, solutions, and materials I'd only read about in conservation journals. Along one wall, glass cabinets displayed pigments organized by color and era, some so rare they looked like precious gems. Dr. Moretti looked up from a manuscript she was examining under a powerful magnifying glass. She was younger than I'd expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to take in every detail at once. When she spoke, her English carried the melodic accent of educated Italian, each word carefully chosen. "So you are the mysterious cardinal," she said, removing her gloves and extending her hand. "I have studied the photographs of your work extensively. Your technique with the 13th century inks is quite remarkable. How did you learn to achieve such accurate color matching?" I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "Trial and error mostly. I studied chemistry in college before switching to art history, so I understood the basic principles of pigment composition. But really, I just practiced on pieces that were already damaged beyond professional restoration." Dr. Moretti raised an eyebrow. "You experimented on original manuscripts?" "Only ones that were completely ruined," I said quickly. "Estate sale finds, things that had been stored in basements or attics for decades. I figured if I destroyed them completely, at least I was learning from the process." To my surprise, Dr. Moretti smiled. "That shows remarkable intuition. Many of our most skilled conservators learned the same way, though they would never admit it in academic circles." She gestured toward the manuscript she was examining. "Would you like to see what we're working on?" The piece spread across her table was breathtaking, a book of hours from the 14th century with margins decorated in gold and ultramarine blue, but large sections of the text had faded to illegibility, and water damage had caused the parchment to buckle and crack. It was exactly the kind of challenge that made my fingers itch to start working. The previous restoration attempt was in 1892, Dr. Moretti explained. They used techniques that we now know were quite damaging. Our task is to undo that damage while preserving the original artist's intent. Tell me, where would you begin? I leaned over the manuscript, studying the different types of damage visible under the magnifying glass. I'd start with documentation, I said slowly. Photograph every page under different light spectra to see what's hidden beneath the surface damage. Then I'd test small areas to understand how the original inks react to different solvents before attempting any cleaning. Excellent. And the structural damage to the parchment? Humidification to relax the buckled areas, but very gradually to avoid shocking the fibers. The cracks would need to be stabilized with tissue and wheat starch paste, applied from the versa
side to avoid affecting the surface decoration. Dr. Moretti nodded approvingly. You think like a conservator, not just an artist. That's rarer than you might think. She covered the manuscript with acid-free tissue. Cardinal Bertoli, I believe Miss Rodriguez will fit in well here. Shall we show her the piece we've selected for her first assignment? Cardinal Bertoli led us to another room, this one dedicated to the most precious items in the collection. Climate controls monitored temperature and humidity to the decimal point, and everything was bathed in the gentle glow of specially filtered lighting. In the center of the room sat a single manuscript, open to reveal pages that made my heart stop. The text was written in Latin, with elaborately decorated initial letters that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Gold leaf caught the light at every angle, while deep blues and crimsons created images of saints and angels that looked ready to step off the page. But what made me gasp was the level of damage visible throughout the piece. Entire sections had been abraded away, leaving ghostly outlines where beautiful illustrations once existed. This is the Codex Aureus of Sant Emmeram, Cardinal Bertoli said softly. 9th century, created in the court of Charlemagne. It's one of the most important Carolingian manuscripts in existence, but as you can see, it has suffered terribly over the centuries. Previous restoration attempts have been unsuccessful, Dr. Moretti added. The manuscript is too valuable to risk with conventional techniques, but too damaged to be useful to scholars in its current state. When His Holiness saw your work on your grandmother's prayer book, he specifically requested that this be assigned to you. I walked slowly around the manuscript, viewing it from different angles. The scale of what they were asking was enormous. This wasn't just restoration, it was resurrection. Bringing this manuscript back to its original glory would require months of painstaking work, using techniques I'd never attempted on anything so precious and irreplaceable. I'm honored by the trust you're placing in me, I said carefully, but this manuscript is priceless. What if I make a mistake that can't be undone? That's why you'll be working under supervision, Dr. Moretti replied. I'll be monitoring every step of the process, and we have consultants available who specialize in Carolingian period techniques. But the actual restoration work will be yours. His Holiness was quite specific about that. Cardinal Bertoli placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. Ms. Rodriguez, we wouldn't have brought you here if we weren't confident in your abilities. The Holy Father sees something in your work that goes beyond technical skill. He believes you have been called to this particular service. The weight of that statement settled over me like a mantle. I thought about all the years I'd spent hunched over damaged manuscripts in my tiny apartment, driven by something I couldn't name but couldn't resist. Now I understood that unnamed force had been preparing me for this moment, for this manuscript, for this opportunity to serve something greater than myself. When do I start? I asked. The next 3 weeks were unlike anything I had experienced in my life. Every morning I walked through the Vatican gardens to the conservation laboratory, past fountains and statues that had witnessed centuries of human struggle and triumph. The early morning light filtering through the cypress trees felt like a benediction, blessing the work I was about to undertake. My days began with meditation, a practice Dr. Moretti insisted upon for anyone working with the most precious manuscripts.
You must center yourself before touching these pieces, she explained. Your emotional state, your level of fatigue, even your breathing affects how you handle the materials. These texts have survived for over 1,000 years. They deserve your complete presence and respect. I learned to work with tools I'd never imagined existed. Brushes made from individual Kolinsky hairs that could apply paint in strokes thinner than human hair. Pigments ground from materials that cost more per gram than gold. Solutions mixed according to formulas that had been refined over decades of research into medieval techniques. The Codex Aureus became my world. Under high-powered magnification, I could see the individual brushstrokes of the original artist, the way they'd built up layers of color to create depth and luminosity. I began to understand their working methods, their artistic choices, even what seemed to be their personality quirks. One illuminator had a tendency to make angel wings slightly asymmetrical. Another favored a particular shade of green that appeared nowhere else in medieval art. You're developing a relationship with the original artists, Dr. Moretti observed one afternoon as she watched me work on a particularly challenging section. That's the mark of a true conservator. You're not just repairing damage, you're completing a conversation that was interrupted centuries ago. The physical work was demanding in ways I hadn't expected. Hours spent hunched over the manuscript left my neck and shoulders aching. The concentration required was so intense that I often forgot to eat or drink water. But there was also a meditative quality to the work that I found deeply satisfying. Each tiny repair, each careful application of new pigment to match the original felt like a prayer made visible. Word of my work began to spread through the Vatican's academic community. Scholars who had been waiting years for access to the Codex Aureus started visiting the laboratory to check on my progress. At first, their attention made me nervous, but Dr. Moretti taught me to view their interest as validation rather than pressure. These people have devoted their lives to studying medieval manuscripts. When they see your work and nod in approval, you know you're doing something extraordinary. One afternoon, as I was working on a particularly damaged illumination of St. John the Evangelist, Cardinal Bertoli appeared in the laboratory with a visitor I didn't recognize. The man was tall and scholarly-looking, with the kind of intense gaze that suggested he saw details others missed. Ms. Rodriguez, I'd like you to meet Professor David Chen from Oxford University. He's one of the world's leading experts on Carolingian manuscripts. Professor Chen stepped forward, his eyes already focused on the manuscript rather than on me. I've been following your work from England, he said, his voice carrying the crisp accent of educated British speech. The progress you've made is remarkable. May I? He gestured toward the manuscript. I stepped back to give him room to examine my work. He bent over the manuscript with a magnifying glass, studying the areas I'd restored with the intensity of someone who had spent his career looking at such pieces. After several minutes of silence, he straightened and looked at me with something
Approaching awe. This is extraordinary, he said simply. I've been studying this manuscript for 15 years, and I never imagined it could be restored to this level. You're not just repairing damage, you're revealing details that scholars haven't been able to see for centuries. Dr. Moretti smiled with pride. Elena has been working on this piece for only 3 weeks. At this rate, we'll have the entire codex restored within 6 months. Professor Chen shook his head in amazement. 6 months to restore a manuscript of this importance and complexity? That's unprecedented. He turned to me. Miss Rodriguez, I hope you realize you're not just preserving art. You're making scholarship possible. There are theories about Carolingian illumination that can't be tested without access to properly restored examples like this. As he and Cardinal Bertoli left the laboratory, I felt a new understanding of what my work meant beyond the walls of the conservation department. I wasn't just fulfilling a personal passion or even serving the Vatican's mission to preserve cultural heritage. I was making it possible for scholars around the world to understand medieval art in ways they never could before. That evening, I walked through the streets of Rome, feeling more purposeful than I ever had in my life. The city's ancient stones seemed to whisper stories of all the artists and craftsmen who had worked here over the centuries.
each contributing their skills to something larger than themselves. I was part of that tradition now, connected to a chain of creativity and devotion that stretched back to the very beginnings of Christian art. My small apartment near the Vatican had become a haven filled with art books and supplies, photographs of manuscript details that I studied during my free time, and letters from my family back in California. My mother's latest email included photos from Miguel and Jessica's first anniversary party, everyone asking when I might visit home. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't homesick. I was exactly where I belonged. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the laboratory. I was preparing my workspace when Dr. Moretti approached with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Elena," she said, "His Holiness would like to see your progress on the Codex Aureus. He'll be visiting the laboratory this afternoon." My hands began to shake immediately. Meeting the Pope once at my brother's wedding had been overwhelming enough. Having him examine my work, judge whether I was living up to his expectations, felt terrifying. "What if he's disappointed?" I asked. "What if the restoration isn't what he hoped for?" Dr. Moretti placed a reassuring hand on my arm. "Elena, the Holy Father doesn't involve himself in technical conservation decisions. If he's coming to see your work, it's because he recognizes something sacred in what you're doing. Trust in that." When Pope Francis arrived that afternoon, he came not with the formal entourage I expected, but simply, accompanied only by Cardinal Bertolli and his personal secretary. He moved through the laboratory with the same gentle presence I remembered from the wedding, interested in everything, but never imposing his attention where it wasn't welcome. When he reached my workstation, he studied the restored sections of the Codex Aureus in silence for several long minutes. I stood beside him, hardly daring to breathe, watching his face for any sign of approval or disappointment. Finally, he looked up at me with those kind eyes that seemed to see straight into a person's soul. "Elena," he said softly, "when I look at your work, I see more than technical skill. I see love. Love for the original artists, love for the sacred texts they eliminated, love for the people who will study these pages long after we are gone. That love is what makes this work holy." He paused, then added, "The Vatican has many talented conservators, but what you bring is different. You approach these manuscripts not as historical artifacts, but as living prayers that deserve to continue speaking to the world. That is a rare gift, and we are blessed to have you here." As he prepared to leave, the Pope turned back to me one final time. "The world needs what you can give, Elena. Never doubt that your work matters, because it does. Every page you restore is a light preserved for future generations." After he left, I sat at my workstation feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I'd been entrusted with. This wasn't just a job or even a calling. It was a responsibility to serve something infinitely larger than myself, to be a guardian of human creativity and spiritual expression that had survived for over a millennium. I picked up my brush and returned to work on St. John's halo, each tiny stroke of gold leaf a prayer of gratitude for the path that had led me here. Outside the laboratory windows, the Roman sun was setting over the eternal city, painting the sky in shades that perfectly matched the pigments I was using to bring ancient beauty back to life. For the first time since arriving in Rome, I felt completely at home, not just in the city or the Vatican, but in my own skin, in my own purpose, in the work that I now understood had been waiting for me all along. I was no longer Elena Rodriguez, the invisible sister from Riverside, California. I was the Cardinal, keeper of sacred art, guardian of ancient prayers, and servant of beauty that transcended time itself. 18 months after arriving in Rome, I was reviewing conservation proposals in my new office when Dr. Moretti knocked on my door with an expression I'd learned to recognize. It meant someone unexpected wanted to see me, and in Vatican circles, unexpected visitors usually carried significant weight. "Elena," she said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her, There's a gentleman here from California. He says he's your brother, but he doesn't look like he's here for a casual visit." My stomach dropped. Miguel had sent a few emails over the past year, but our communication had become sporadic as I'd settled into my life in Rome. The last I had heard, he and Jessica were thinking about starting a family and had bought a house closer to his work in San Francisco. What could possibly bring him all the way to the Vatican unannounced? I found Miguel in the main reception area, looking completely out of place in his Silicon Valley casual attire among the formal surroundings of Vatican administration. When he saw me, his face broke into the familiar smile I remembered from childhood, but there was something strained around his eyes. "Elena," he said, standing to embrace me. "God, you look different. More confident, I guess. Rome agrees with you. Miguel, what are you doing here? Is everything okay? Is it Mama or Papa?" "Everyone's fine," he said quickly. "Well, mostly fine. Can we talk somewhere private? I have something I need to discuss with you." I led him to a small garden courtyard where Vatican staff sometimes took their breaks. The October afternoon was warm and peaceful,
the sound of fountains providing a gentle backdrop for conversation. Miguel sat heavily on a stone bench, running his hands through his hair in a gesture and recognized from whenever he was nervous or upset. "I need to tell you something," he began, "and I don't know how to say it without sounding like a complete bastard." He paused, looking down at his hands. "Elena, I've been taking credit for your work. Not here, not the Vatican stuff, but back home. When people ask about my successful sister who works for the Pope, I let them think I always knew how talented you were. I let them believe I was supportive of your art career all along." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the old pain of being overlooked and minimized. "Miguel, why are you telling me this now?" "Because Jessica's pregnant," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I keep thinking about what kind of father I want to be, what kind of family I want to build. I realized I can't build something honest on a foundation of lies." He paused, looking down at his hands. "Elena, I've been taking credit for your work. Not here, not the Vatican stuff, but back home. When people ask about my successful sister who works for the Pope, I let them think I always knew how talented you were. I let them believe I was supportive of your art career all along." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the old pain of being overlooked and minimized. "Miguel, why are you telling me this now?" "Because Jessica's pregnant," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I keep thinking about what kind of father I want to be, what kind of family I want to build. I realized I can't build something honest on a foundation of lies." He paused, looking down at his hands. "Elena, I've been taking credit for your work. Not here, not the Vatican stuff, but back home. When people ask about my successful sister who works for the Pope, I let them think I always knew how talented you were. I let them believe I was supportive of your art career all along." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the old pain of being overlooked and minimized. "Miguel, why are you telling me this now?" "Because Jessica's pregnant," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I keep thinking about what kind of father I want to be, what kind of family I want to build. I realized I can't build something honest on a foundation of lies." He looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "Elena, I was a terrible brother to you. For years, I treated your art like it was just a hobby that kept you quiet. When reporters interviewed our family after the Pope thing happened, I talked about how proud I'd always been of you. But that was bullshit. I never paid attention to what you were doing." The confession hung between us in the garden air. Part of me wanted to tell him it didn't matter, that I'd moved beyond caring about past slights. But a larger part recognized that this moment required absolute honesty between us. "You're right," I said quietly. "You were a terrible brother in that way. You all were. I spent years feeling invisible in my own family, like nothing I did was worth noticing unless it served someone else's needs." Miguel flinched,
but didn't look away. I know, and I can't undo that, but I can stop perpetuating it. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. This is from the San Francisco Chronicle. They did a feature story about local families with members in prestigious international positions. I told them I didn't deserve to be interviewed because I'd never supported your career until after it brought our family recognition. I unfolded the clipping and read the brief quote attributed to Miguel Rodriguez. My sister Elena has always been an extraordinary artist, but I was too self-absorbed to recognize her talent until the Vatican did it for me. She succeeded despite her family's indifference, not because of our support. I'm working to become the brother she deserved all along. Miguel, I said, feeling my throat tighten, you didn't have to do this publicly. Yes, I did, he replied firmly, because living with the lie was eating me alive, and because our kid deserves to grow up in a family where we actually see each other clearly. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Elena, can you forgive me? Not for the past, because I know that's going to take time, but can you forgive me enough to let me try to be a better brother going forward? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with an urgent message from Cardinal Bertoli requesting my immediate presence in his office. I showed Miguel the message and he nodded understanding. I'm staying in Rome for 3 days, he said. Jessica insisted I take the time to have real conversations, not just quick apologies. Maybe you could show me what you do here. Help me understand the work that I should have been asking about all these years. Cardinal Bertoli's office was unusually crowded when I arrived. Dr. Moretti was there, along with Professor Chen, who had apparently flown in from Oxford that morning. Several other Vatican officials I recognized but didn't know personally were seated around the conference table, all wearing expressions of barely contained excitement. Elena, Cardinal Bertoli said as I entered, please sit down. We have extraordinary news to share with you. Professor Chen leaned forward in his chair. Elena, the restoration work you completed on the Codex Aureus has been submitted for the UNESCO Memory of the World Register. But more than that, your innovative techniques for recovering damaged illuminations have been recognized by the International Institute for Conservation. They want to offer you their highest honor, the Plenderolith Award for Outstanding Contributions to Conservation Science. I felt dizzy. The Plenderolith Award was given only once every 5 years, and previous recipients included conservators whose work had saved entire museum collections and archaeological sites. I don't understand, I said. I've only been doing this professionally for 18 months. Which makes your achievements even more remarkable, Dr. Moretti interjected. Elena, your technique for using spectral analysis to guide pigment reconstruction has revolutionized how we approach damaged illuminated manuscripts. Conservators around the world are requesting training in your methods. Cardinal Bertoli smiled warmly. The Holy Father has asked me to convey his congratulations and to inform you that the Vatican would like to establish a new department dedicated to advanced manuscript conservation with you as its director. We're prepared to offer you whatever resources you need to train the next generation of conservators in your techniques. The room spun slightly as I processed what they were telling me. This wasn't just recognition of my work, it was an invitation to reshape an entire field of study. I'm honored, I managed to say, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to direct an entire department. Professor Chen laughed. Elena, you've restored manuscripts that experts said were beyond saving. You've developed techniques that didn't exist 2 years ago. You've earned the personal recognition of the Pope and the admiration of scholars worldwide. If you're not qualified, no one is. As the meeting continued with discussions of budget allocations and staffing hiring, my mind drifted to Miguel waiting in the garden. For so many years, I'd craved this kind of recognition from my family, this acknowledgement that my work mattered. Now, surrounded by some of the most respected figures in international conservation, I realized that the validation I'd once desperately needed from my family was no longer the measure of my worth. That evening, I took Miguel through the Vatican museums after hours, showing him the manuscripts I'd been working on and explaining the techniques I'd developed. He listened with an attention I'd never experienced from him before, asking thoughtful questions and genuinely trying to understand the complexity of what I was doing.
"This is incredible," he said, as I showed him the before and after photographs of the Codex Aureus. "Alina, this isn't just art restoration. This is like bringing the dead back to life." We stopped in front of a display case containing a 13th century Psalter I'd recently completed. The gold leaf caught the gallery lighting, making the illumination.
Letters seemed to glow from within. Miguel studied it in silence for several minutes. "I remember when you were working on Grandmother's prayer book," he said finally. "I walked into your room once and saw you hunched over it with all these tiny brushes and bottles of stuff. I thought you were just playing around, maybe trying to clean it up. I had no idea you were doing something this sophisticated." "I didn't know either," I admitted. "I was just trying to save something beautiful that was falling apart." "That's what you've always done," Miguel said, turning to look at me. "Even as kids, you were always trying to fix things, preserve things. Remember when you found that injured bird and kept it in a shoebox until it could fly again? Or when you spent weeks gluing the pages back into Dad's old photo albums after the basement flooded?" I had forgotten about those incidents, but hearing Miguel mention them made me realize that my calling to conservation work had roots much deeper than I'd understood. I'd always been drawn to healing damaged things, to preserving beauty that was at risk of being lost forever. The next morning, Miguel joined me for breakfast at a small cafe near the Vatican where I'd become a regular. As we sat watching Roman life flow past the windows, he brought up something that had been bothering him since his arrival. "Alina, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. Do you ever plan to come home? Not to visit, but to live?" The question caught me off guard. "I haven't really thought about it," I said. "My work is here. My life is here now." "But what about family? What about having kids someday? What about growing old somewhere familiar?" I considered his questions carefully. "Miguel, for the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I belong. I'm doing work that matters, work that I love, work that makes a difference. I have colleagues who respect me, a mentor who believes in me, and opportunities I never could have imagined. Why would I give that up to go back to being invisible in Riverside?" Miguel nodded slowly. "I guess what I'm really asking is whether you can forgive us enough to want to be part of the family again, even from a distance." "I never stopped wanting to be part of the family," I said. "I just stopped believing it was possible." That afternoon, as Miguel prepared to leave for the airport, we stood in the same garden courtyard where we'd had our difficult conversation 2 days earlier. The October sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ancient stones and making everything look touched with gold. "I have something for you," Miguel said, reaching into his carry-on bag. He pulled out a small wrapped package and handed it to me. "It's from Mama. She said to tell you she's sorry it took her so long to understand." I unwrapped the package to find a small wooden box I recognized from my childhood. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was a set of miniature paintbrushes that had belonged to my great-grandmother, along with a note in my mother's handwriting. "Mija, I found these in the attic when I was looking for Miguel's baby pictures to frame for the nursery. Your great-grandmother was an artist too, but we never talked about it because women weren't supposed to have careers back then. She would have been so proud to know that her brushes would be used by someone with your gift. With all my love and admiration, Mama." Tears blurred my vision as I held the delicate brushes, thinking about the generations of women in my family who had carried artistic gifts that went unrecognized or unexpressed. I thought about my great-grandmother painting in secret, my grandmother preserving her prayer book with such care, and my own journey from invisible daughter to internationally recognized conservator. "Tell her thank you," I said to Miguel, "and tell her that I finally understand why it took her so long to see me clearly. Sometimes we can't recognize something until we're ready to understand what it means." 6 months later, I stood in the center of the new Advanced Manuscript Conservation Institute, watching as scholars and conservators from around the world examined the teaching materials we'd developed.
The institute occupied an entire building adjacent to the Vatican museums, equipped with the most sophisticated conservation technology available and staffed by experts I'd recruited from universities and museums across Europe and America. Professor Chen had accepted my invitation to serve as the institute's first visiting scholar, bringing his expertise in medieval manuscript studies to complement our conservation focus. Dr. Moretti had been promoted to assistant director, and together we were training a new generation of conservators in techniques that were already being adopted by institutions worldwide. The opening ceremony was attended by dignitaries from UNESCO, directors of major museums, and academics whose work I'd admired for years. But the presence that meant the most to me was my family, who had flown in from California to witness this milestone. My parents sat in the front row, my mother dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief as I delivered my opening address. Miguel and Jessica, now visibly pregnant, beamed with pride that I finally believed was genuine. They had spent the past 6 months sending me articles about my work that appeared in American publications, updates on how their friends and colleagues reacted when they mentioned their connection to the Cardinal. As I spoke about the importance of preserving cultural heritage for future generations, I caught sight of Father Augustine in the audience. He had made the journey from California at my personal invitation, and his presence felt like a blessing on everything I'd accomplished. That evening, the Vatican hosted a reception in the Sistine Chapel, an honor that left me speechless. Standing beneath Michelangelo's frescoes, surrounded by some of the most important cultural preservation experts in the world, I felt the full weight of how far I'd traveled from that lavender bridesmaid dress and the sting of being overlooked at my own brother's wedding. Pope Francis approached me during the reception, moving through the gathered crowd with his characteristic humility. When he reached me, he smiled with the warmth I'd come to associate with moments of profound recognition. "Elena,"
he said quietly, "when I interrupted your brother's wedding that day, I knew we were gaining a gifted conservator. I didn't realize we were also gaining a teacher, a leader, and an inspiration to others. You have exceeded every expectation." "Your Holiness," I replied, "that day changed my entire life. I can never thank you enough for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself." "My dear child," he said, "I didn't see anything that wasn't already there. I simply recognized it and called it forth. That's what good shepherds do. They help their flock discover the gifts they already possess." As the reception continued around us, I found myself drawn to one of the chapel's windows, looking out over the lights of Rome spreading toward the horizon. Somewhere out there was the old mission Santa Clara, where I'd first begun to understand my calling. Somewhere were the thrift stores and estate sales, where I'd found my first damaged manuscripts. Somewhere was the apartment where I'd spent countless hours learning to heal broken beauty with nothing but patience and love. All of those places, all of those moments had been leading me here, not just to Rome or to the Vatican or to international recognition, but to an understanding of who I was meant to be. I wasn't Elena Rodriguez who happened to restore manuscripts. I was the Cardinal, a guardian of sacred art, a teacher of ancient techniques, a bridge between the creativity of the past and the preservation needs of the future. The next morning, I woke in my apartment near the Vatican and walked to my office through the familiar streets of Rome. The city had become my home in ways that Riverside never had, not because the architecture was more beautiful or the culture more sophisticated, but because this was where my deepest gifts were recognized, valued, and put to their highest use. I unlocked the doors of the Conservation Institute and walked through the quiet laboratories, past the equipment that would soon be humming with the work of students from around the world. In a few hours, this place would be filled with the next generation of conservators, people who would carry these techniques to museums and libraries and private collections across the globe. But for now, in the early morning silence, I stood in the center of the main laboratory and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. I thought about the wedding day when I felt invisible, the bus ride to Willow Creek when I thought my life was over,
The moment when Father Augustine helped me understand that my work was a form of prayer. I was no longer the woman who measured her worth by other people's recognition. I was no longer the sister who needed her family's validation to feel valuable. I was Elena Rodriguez, director of the Advanced Manuscript Conservation Institute, the Cardinal whose techniques were revolutionizing an entire field, the woman who had found her calling in healing damaged beauty and helping others do the same. My phone buzzed with the day's first message, a note from a conservator in Japan who was using my techniques to restore earthquake-damaged temple scrolls. Tomorrow would bring emails from students applying for next year's program, requests for consultation on projects in libraries I'd never heard of, invitations to speak at conferences in cities I'd never imagined visiting. The work was never finished. There would always be more manuscripts in need of healing, more students eager to learn, more techniques to develop and refine. But standing there in the morning light streaming through the laboratory windows, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition or achievement and everything to do with purpose. I had found my place in the world, not by seeking it out, but by following the work that called to my deepest gifts. I had discovered that being invisible to some people didn't make me invisible to the world. I had learned that the recognition that mattered most came not from family or critics or institutions, but from the quiet voice inside that whispered, "This is who you were meant to be," every time I picked up a brush to heal something beautiful that was broken. Outside, the bells of Rome were beginning to chime the hour, calling the faithful to morning prayers across the eternal city. I smiled and began preparing my workspace for another day of sacred work, another day of being exactly who I was meant to be, another day of living as the Cardinal who had been found. 3 years after establishing the Advanced Manuscript Conservation Institute, I received a phone call that would change everything once again. I was in my office reviewing applications for our newest fellowship program when my assistant knocked softly on the door, her expression suggesting the call was both important and unexpected. "Elena, there's someone on the line from the Getty Conservation Institute in Los Angeles. They say it's urgent and concerns a discovery in California that requires your specific expertise." I took the call immediately, recognizing the voice of Dr. Sarah Martinez, a conservator whose work I'd followed for years. Her tone carried an excitement barely contained by professional courtesy. "Elena, we've made an extraordinary discovery at Mission San Juan Capistrano during restoration work on the original chapel. Behind a false wall, we found a cache of manuscripts that appeared to date from the late 1700s, created by Native American scribes working with Spanish missionaries. But here's the remarkable part. The techniques used are unlike anything we've seen from that period. The illumination work shows influences that shouldn't have existed in colonial California." She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "The manuscript condition is critical. Water damage, insect infestation, and centuries of neglect have left them barely legible. Our team has tried preliminary assessment, but frankly, we're out of our depth. These pieces require someone with your particular combination of skills, not just technical expertise, but the intuitive understanding of how different cultural traditions might have blended in ways we've never documented." My heart began racing as she described the discovery. Native American manuscripts from colonial California were virtually non-existent in historical records. Finding a cache of them, especially one showing unique artistic influences, would rewrite understanding of cultural exchange during the mission period.
Forever. The weight of her words settled over me like a mantle. This wasn't just about conservation techniques or academic prestige. This was about cultural justice, about giving voice to people whose stories had been systematically erased from historical records. "How long would you need me?" I asked. "Honestly, we don't know. The initial assessment suggests at least 6 months of intensive work, possibly longer. But Elena, we're prepared to make this worth your while. The Getty is offering full funding for a temporary satellite program of your institute here in Los Angeles. You could bring your most advanced students, establish a West Coast presence, and work on the most culturally significant discovery in decades." After hanging up, I sat in my office staring out at the Roman skyline, weighing the decision before me.
The institute was thriving beyond my wildest expectations. We had a waiting list of students from around the world, ongoing projects with major museums, and research initiatives that were pushing the boundaries of conservation science. Leaving, even temporarily, felt like abandoning something I'd built from nothing. But as I thought about those damaged manuscripts lying in storage, holding stories that might never be told if they weren't properly preserved, I knew what I had to do. Some opportunities transcended personal comfort or professional stability. Some work was too important to decline. I called Dr. Moretti into my office and explained the situation. Her response was immediate and characteristically insightful. Elena, you have to go, not just because of the manuscripts, though they sound extraordinary. You have to go because this is exactly the kind of work that made you who you are. Bringing silenced voices back to life, preserving beauty that others have given up on, that's your calling, not managing an institution. But the institute needs leadership. The students need continuity. The institute needs to prove it can function without being dependent on its founder, she replied with a smile. And frankly, I've been wanting more responsibility for months. Let me run things here while you establish our first international program. Think of it as expansion, not abandonment. The decision to temporarily relocate to California felt both terrifying and inevitable. I had spent 3 years building a life in Rome that fulfilled me in ways I'd never imagined possible. But as I began planning for the move, I realized that my sense of home had evolved beyond any single location. Home was wherever I could do work that mattered, wherever my skills could serve their highest purpose. The logistics of moving an entire conservation operation across the Atlantic were staggering. We had to transport specialized equipment, coordinate with U.S. customs officials about bringing centuries-old artifacts into the country, and establish temporary laboratory space that met international standards for manuscript preservation. But by late spring, I found myself back in Southern California for the first time since leaving for Rome, surrounded by familiar landscapes that felt both nostalgic and strange. The temporary laboratory at the Getty Center was a marvel of modern conservation technology, with climate controls that could maintain precise environmental conditions and imaging equipment that could reveal details invisible to the naked eye. When I first examined the discovered manuscripts under high-powered magnification, I understood immediately why Dr. Martinez had been so excited. The native scribes had developed techniques that blended traditional indigenous artistic practices with European illumination methods in ways that created something new. They'd use local materials, pigments derived from prickly pear cactus sap, binding agents made from native tree resins, even gold leaf that appeared to have been panned from local streams, but applied them with sophisticated understanding of European manuscript traditions. More importantly, the content revealed perspectives on mission life that contradicted almost everything in official Spanish records. These were native voices describing their own experiences, their attempts to maintain cultural practices within the constraints of colonial rule, their complex relationships with the missionary fathers. Some passages were written in Spanish, others in what appeared to be indigenous languages I didn't recognize, and still others in a hybrid script that suggested bilingual authors. The condition of the manuscripts was heartbreaking. Centuries of neglect had left them fragmented and faded, with entire sections crumbling at the slightest touch. Traditional conservation approaches would be too harsh for materials that were already barely holding together. I needed to develop entirely new techniques for this specific combination of native and European materials. Working on these manuscripts felt different from anything I'd done before. With European texts, I could research historical techniques and materials, understand the cultural context that shaped artistic choices. But these pieces represented a cultural fusion that had no documented precedent. I was essentially learning as I worked, guided by intuition and careful observation rather than established protocols. The first breakthrough came when I realized that the native scribes had used a binding agent derived from prickly pear cactus sap, a traditional material I'd never encountered in European manuscripts. Once I understood their material choices, I could develop appropriate conservation treatments that worked with their original techniques rather than against them. But the real revelation came when I began working on a particularly damaged section that contained what appeared to be a bilingual text. As I carefully cleaned away centuries of dirt and staining, images began to emerge that took my breath away. The illumination showed Native people engaged in traditional ceremonies but incorporated Christian symbols in ways that suggested synthesis rather than replacement of indigenous practices. One image in particular stopped me cold. It showed a Native woman creating illuminated manuscripts, her tools spread around her in careful arrangement, working by candlelight in what appeared to be a mission chapel. The detail was extraordinary. I could see individual brushes, containers of pigment, even the concentrated expression on her face as she worked. This wasn't just a historical document. It was a self-portrait by one of the original artists, a Native woman asserting her presence in the historical record through her own artistic skill. She had painted herself into existence, ensuring that future generations would know that Native people weren't just subjects of colonial documentation, but creators of their own narratives. I called Dr. Martinez immediately, my voice shaking with excitement. "Sarah, you need to see this. We're not just looking at manuscripts created by Native scribes, we're looking
At what might be the first self-portrait by a Native American woman artist in the colonial period. The discovery made international news within days. Art historians, anthropologists, and cultural preservationists from around the world contacted the Getty, requesting access to the manuscripts. Native American tribes in California expressed interest in reclaiming cultural materials that had been lost for centuries. The Smithsonian offered to fund a traveling exhibition once conservation was complete. But more than the academic excitement, I felt a deep personal connection to these anonymous artists who had worked in secrecy to preserve their stories. Like me, they had been overlooked by the official record keepers of their time. Like me, they had found ways to make their voices heard through careful, patient work that others might dismiss as merely decorative. As months passed and more manuscripts revealed their secrets, I began to understand that this project was changing me in ways I hadn't expected. Working with these pieces required not just technical skill, but cultural sensitivity and historical imagination. I had to think beyond European artistic traditions, beyond established conservation protocols, beyond my own assumptions about what manuscripts could contain or represent. The work also brought me back into regular contact with my family in ways that felt natural rather than obligated. My parents visited the Getty several times, fascinated by the discovery and proud to see their daughter's work featured in major news outlets. Miguel and Jessica, now parents to a toddler named Sophia, made the drive from San Francisco to see the manuscripts and understand what had drawn me back to California. "It's incredible," Miguel said as I showed him through the conservation laboratory. "These people found a way to preserve their culture even when everything was trying to erase it. They hid their stories inside something that looked acceptable to the colonizers." I nodded, struck by how clearly he'd grasped the significance of what we were uncovering. That's exactly right. They used European techniques to preserve Native perspectives. It was a brilliant survival strategy disguised as artistic collaboration. Jessica, holding Sophia while the toddler stared wide-eyed at the microscopes and special lighting, asked a question that had been bothering me for weeks. "Elena, what happens to these manuscripts when your conservation work is finished? Who gets to decide where they belong?" It was a crucial question that touched on issues of cultural ownership, institutional authority, and historical justice. The manuscripts had been discovered on land that was originally Native territory, created by Native artists, but found during restoration work funded by the Catholic Church at a site that was now a California state park. The legal and ethical questions were as complex as the conservation challenges. Working with tribal representatives became an essential part of the project.
Leaders from several California tribes visited the laboratory to see the manuscripts and share their perspectives on appropriate preservation and display methods. These conversations taught me things about cultural conservation that no European training had prepared me for. These aren't just artifacts, explained Maria Sandoval, a cultural preservation officer from the Kumeyaay Nation. They're ancestral voices speaking across centuries. How we care for them, how we share them, how we honor them. All of that matters as much as the technical preservation work. Her words resonated deeply as I continued working on the manuscripts. Conservation wasn't just about preventing physical deterioration. It was about maintaining the spiritual and cultural integrity of materials that carried profound meaning for communities whose voices had been systematically suppressed. The project took on dimensions I'd never encountered in my European work. Beyond the technical challenges of preservation, I found myself coordinating with tribal historians, consulting with anthropologists about cultural protocols, and learning about native artistic traditions that had survived in oral form even when written records were destroyed. One afternoon, as I worked on a particularly delicate section showing Native children learning to read and write in both Spanish and their indigenous language, I realized how profoundly this project had changed my understanding of my own calling. Conservation wasn't just about preserving the past. It was about making sure marginalized voices could speak to the future. The technical work reached completion after 8 months, but the cultural and educational impact was just beginning. The Getty organized symposiums, bringing together conservators, tribal representatives, historians, and artists to discuss what the manuscripts revealed about cultural survival and artistic resistance. Universities incorporated the discovery into courses on colonial history, Native American studies, and art conservation ethics. Most meaningfully, several California tribes expressed interest in establishing their own cultural preservation programs, with young Native people learning conservation techniques that could be applied to materials in their own communities. The project had gone beyond preserving historical artifacts to inspiring contemporary cultural revitalization efforts.
Communities would have ongoing input into how their ancestors' work was presented and interpreted. Elena, Dr. Martinez said as we reviewed the exhibition plans, this project has changed how our institution thinks about conservation ethics and community engagement. You've shown us that the most important preservation work happens at the intersection of technical expertise and cultural understanding. That evening, I had dinner with my family at the same Mexican restaurant where Miguel and I had said goodbye before I left for Rome. This time, the conversation felt different. Instead of explaining my work to people who didn't understand its significance, I was sharing discoveries with family members who had watched the project unfold and understood its importance. "So what's next?" my mother asked. "Are you staying in California or going back to Rome?" I'd been wrestling with that question for weeks. The Getty had offered me a permanent position directing their manuscript conservation program. Several universities had extended invitations to establish conservation departments. The Vatican had made it clear that my position in Rome remained open whenever I chose to return. "I think I've realized something important," I said, looking around the table at faces that showed genuine interest in my answer. "My work isn't tied to any single institution or location anymore. It's about going wherever the most important preservation challenges exist, wherever voices need to be recovered, wherever beauty needs to be saved." Miguel smiled. "So you're going to become an international conservation consultant?" "Something like that. The Institute in Rome is thriving under Dr. Moretti's leadership. The satellite program here has proven we can work effectively across continents. Maybe it's time to think bigger about how conservation work can serve cultural justice and historical preservation." Sophia, who had been quietly coloring throughout dinner, suddenly looked up and asked in her 3-year-old voice, "Tia Elena, are you going to fix more broken books?" I laughed, struck by how perfectly a toddler had summarized my life's work. "Yes, Sophia, I'm going to fix more broken books and help other people learn to fix them too."
As I boarded the plane back to Rome the next morning, I carried with me not just the satisfaction of a successful project, but a renewed understanding of my purpose in the world. I was no longer just Elena Rodriguez, the woman who had been overlooked at her brother's wedding. I wasn't even just the Cardinal, the manuscript restorer who had impressed Vatican scholars. I was someone who helped silenced voices speak across centuries, who preserved beauty that might otherwise be lost forever, who brought together technical expertise and cultural sensitivity to serve something larger than any individual institution or tradition. My work had evolved beyond restoration to include education, cultural preservation, and historical justice. The plane lifted off from Los Angeles as the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in colors that reminded me of the illuminated manuscripts that had shaped my career. Below, I could see the lights of the city spreading toward the horizon, each one representing a life, a story, a voice that deserved to be heard and remembered. I opened my notebook and began sketching plans for a new kind of conservation organization, one that could respond quickly to discoveries like the California manuscripts, that could train conservators from underrepresented communities, that could help institutions develop ethical approaches to culturally sensitive materials. The technical skills I'd learned in Rome, the cultural sensitivity I'd developed in California, the collaborative methods I'd pioneered with tribal communities, all of it was pointing towards something larger than I'd ever imagined. As the plane crossed into the night sky over the Pacific, I whispered a prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. From the invisible sister in a lavender bridesmaid's dress to an internationally recognized conservator whose work was helping rewrite history, the transformation still amazed me sometimes. But more than my personal journey, I thought about all the artists whose work I had the privilege to preserve. The medieval monks whose prayers had been made visible in gold and ultramarine, the native scribes whose cultural resistance had been disguised as artistic collaboration, the anonymous women whose creative gifts had been overlooked by their contemporaries but could now speak to future generations through carefully restored manuscripts. Every conservation project was ultimately about connection, connecting past and present, connecting artistic traditions across cultures, connecting marginalized voices to contemporary audiences who needed to hear their stories. My calling wasn't just about fixing broken books, as Sophia had so perfectly put it. It was about fixing broken connections between people separated by time, culture, and historical injustice. The plane carried me eastward through the night toward Rome and whatever challenges awaited there, toward new projects and discoveries I couldn't yet imagine. But I flew with confidence that whatever came next, I would meet it as someone who had found her place in the world not by seeking recognition or avoiding rejection, but by following the work that called to her deepest gifts. I was the Cardinal, guardian of sacred art, teacher of ancient techniques, bridge between cultures and centuries, but more than any title or position, I was simply Elena Rodriguez, a woman who had learned that being overlooked by some people didn't make you invisible to the world, and that the most important recognition came from the quiet voice inside that whispered, "This is who you are meant to be," every time you picked up a brush to heal something beautiful that was broken. The manuscript of my own life was still being written, each day adding new illuminations to a story that had begun with feeling invisible and had become about making sure other voices would never be silenced again. And Rome's lights appeared on the horizon ahead, and I smiled and prepared for whatever chapter would come next.
My work in establishing collaborative preservation programs between indigenous communities and academic institutions worldwide. The California Project had inspired similar efforts in Australia, South America, and Africa, where my methods were being used to recover suppressed cultural narratives from colonial-era documents. Dr. Moretti found me sitting in stunned silence at my desk, still holding the letter. "Elena, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I handed her the letter wordlessly and watched her expression change from concern to amazement to tears of joy. "Madonna mia," she whispered in Italian. "Elena, do you understand what this means? You're not just being recognized as a conservator. You're being acknowledged as someone whose work promotes peace and human understanding." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of media attention, congratulatory messages from colleagues around the world, and preparations for the ceremony in Oslo. But beneath the excitement, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought me to this point.
From being invisible at my brother's wedding to standing on the world stage as an advocate for cultural preservation and historical justice seemed impossible. Yet here I was. The nomination process required extensive documentation of my work's impact beyond academic circles. I spent hours compiling evidence of how our conservation projects had helped heal relationships between indigenous communities and the institutions that house their ancestral materials. Letters poured in from tribal leaders, museum directors, and university researchers describing how our collaborative approach had transformed their understanding of cultural stewardship. One letter particularly moved me, from Dr. Running Bear, a Native American historian whose great-grandmother's stories had been preserved in one of the manuscripts we'd restored in California. "Dr. Rodriguez," she wrote, "your work gave us back our ancestors' voice. My grandmother died thinking our family's stories were lost forever. Now her great-great-grandchildren can hear those stories in their ancestors' own words. You didn't just preserve ink and paper, you preserved souls." As the ceremony date approached, I made a decision that surprised everyone around me. Instead of attending alone, or with Vatican officials, I invited my entire family to accompany me to Oslo. Miguel and Jessica, now parents to 3 children, my parents who had finally learned to see their daughter's gifts, and even Father Augustine, who, at 87, insisted he was strong enough to make the journey to witness what he called the fulfillment of God's plan. The night before the ceremony, we gathered in my hotel suite overlooking the fjords of Oslo. My nephew Carlos, now 8 years old and fascinated by his aunt's work, sat on the floor surrounded by photographs I'd brought, showing some of the manuscripts I'd restored over the years. "Tia Elena," he said, studying a picture of the Codex Aureus, "why do you fix old books instead of just buying new ones?" The question was so innocent, so perfectly childlike, that it made me laugh. But as I thought about how to answer, I realized he'd asked something profound about the nature of my calling. "Carlos, imagine if someone threw away all the family photos from when your daddy was little and from when your grandparents were young. How would you know where you came from? How would you understand your family's story?" He frowned, considering this. "That would be sad. I like looking at pictures of Daddy when he was little." "These old books are like family photos for all of humanity," I explained. "They tell us how people lived and thought and felt hundreds of years ago. When they get damaged, those stories might disappear forever unless someone takes care of them." Miguel, listening from across the room, added quietly, "Your Tia Elena makes sure that voices from the past can still speak to people today." The next morning, as I prepared for the ceremony, I thought about how different this recognition felt from anything I'd experienced before. The Vatican honors, the academic awards, the professional accolades had all felt like external validation of my skills. But this nomination represented something deeper. Acknowledgement that my work served human dignity and promoted understanding between cultures separated by centuries and continents. The ceremony itself was both magnificent and surreal. Sitting in the Oslo City Hall among Nobel laureates, diplomats, and world leaders, I felt the weight of representing not just my own achievements, but the countless unnamed artists whose work I'd been privileged to preserve. When my name was called and I walked to the podium to deliver my acceptance speech, I carried with me the voices of medieval monks, Native American scribes, and all the anonymous creators whose gifts had been overlooked by their contemporaries. "Your Majesty's distinguished bests," I began, looking out over an audience that included some of the most influential people in the world. "I stand before you today not as an individual achievement, but as a representative of everyone who has ever believed that human creativity deserves to survive across time and cultural boundaries." I spoke about the manuscripts that had shaped my understanding of conservation as a form of peace-building. When we restore a damaged text created by people whose voices were suppressed, we're not just preserving paper and ink, we're asserting that every human perspective has value, that cultural diversity strengthens rather than threatens our shared humanity. The speech continued with examples from projects around the world where conservation work had helped heal historical wounds. Aboriginal song cycles recovered from mission records in Australia, Mayan codices reconstructed from fragments scattered across European museums, African praise poems preserved in documents created during the colonial period. Each project had required not just technical skill, but cultural sensitivity and collaborative spirit. The manuscripts I've had the privilege to preserve have taught me that human creativity is ultimately about connection, I said, thinking of Carlos's question about family photos. These texts represent attempts to communicate across time, to ensure that knowledge, beauty, and wisdom created in one generation could inspire future generations. When we preserve them, we're honoring that impulse to connect, to share, to build bridges between past and present. As I concluded my speech, I looked toward the section where my family sat and saw tears streaming down my mother's face. Father Augustine sat with his hands folded, smiling with the satisfaction of someone who had always known this moment would come. Miguel gave me a thumbs up, the same gesture he'd used when we were children, and I'd accomplished something that made him proud. The reception following the ceremony was a blur of conversations with people whose work I'd admired for years. Scientists who were using conservation techniques to preserve climate data from ancient ice cores. Historians who were applying our collaborative methods to projects involving refugee communities. Artists who were creating new works inspired by the recovered voices and restored manuscripts. But the conversation that affected me most deeply was with Dr. Amara Cohn, a cultural preservationist from Mali, who had adapted our techniques to work with traditional textiles and oral histories. Dr. Rodriguez, she said, your work has shown us that preservation is an act of love. Not just love for beautiful objects, but love for the people who created them and the communities who carry their legacy. Her words encapsulated something I've been trying to articulate about why this work mattered so much. Conservation wasn't just an academic discipline or technical skill. It was a form of caregiving that extended across centuries, a way of honoring human creativity and ensuring that no voice was permanently silenced by time or historical injustice. Later that evening, as my family and I walked along the Oslo waterfront under the northern lights, Miguel asked a question that had been bothering him since the ceremony. Elena, do you ever think about what would have happened if the Pope hadn't shown up at my wedding? If you'd just stayed in Riverside and kept working at the museum? I considered his question as we watched the aurora dance across the sky in colors that reminded me of illuminated manuscripts. I think about it sometimes, I said, but you know what I've learned? The calling was always there. Maybe it would have manifested differently, but I don't think I could have escaped it entirely. Some purposes are larger than the circumstances that reveal them. Father Augustine, walking slowly but steadily beside us despite his age, added his perspective. Miguel, your sister didn't become extraordinary when the Pope recognized her. She was always extraordinary. Recognition just gave her permission to be who she'd always been meant to be. The next day, as we prepared to return to our respective homes, I found myself in the hotel gift shop looking for something to commemorate this moment. Among the typical tourist items, I discovered a small journal bound in handmade paper, its cover decorated with traditional Norwegian folk art. Something about it reminded me of the first manuscript I'd ever restored, my grandmother's prayer book that had started this entire journey. I bought the journal and spent the flight back to Rome, filling its pages with reflections on the path that had brought me to this point. I wrote about the girl who had felt invisible at her brother's wedding, the woman who had found purpose in healing damaged beauty, the professional who had learned that the most important work happened at the intersection of technical skill and cultural understanding. But mostly, I wrote about gratitude. Gratitude for the artists whose work I'd been privileged to preserve, gratitude for the mentors who had guided my development, gratitude for the family who had learned to see me clearly, gratitude for the opportunities to serve something larger than myself through work that felt like prayer made visible. Returning to Rome after the Nobel ceremony felt like coming home to a life that finally made complete sense. The Advanced Manuscript Conservation Institute had grown beyond anything I'd originally envisioned, with satellite programs on 4 continents and collaborative projects involving dozens of cultural communities. My office walls were covered in photographs from restoration projects around the world, each one representing voices recovered from the silence of historical neglect.
Dr. Moretti, who had been managing the institute in my absence, greeted me with news that would have seemed overwhelming just a few years earlier, but now felt like a natural extension of our mission. UNESCO wanted to establish a new category of World Heritage designation specifically for intangible cultural materials preserved through manuscript conservation, with our institute serving as the coordinating body for global certification efforts. "Alina," she said, spreading the proposal documents across my desk, "they're essentially asking us to become the Vatican of cultural preservation. Every significant manuscript discovery, every community seeking to recover lost narratives, every institution needing guidance on ethical conservation practices would come through us." The scope of what they were proposing was staggering, but as I reviewed the documents, I felt the familiar stirring that had guided every major decision in my career. This wasn't just about expanding our influence or taking on more prestigious projects. It was about systematizing the approach we'd developed, ensuring that future discoveries would be handled with the cultural sensitivity and collaborative spirit that had made our work effective. Over the following months, I found myself traveling constantly, establishing partnerships with universities, museums, and cultural communities around the world. Each trip revealed new challenges and opportunities for applying conservation techniques to serve cultural preservation and historical justice. In New Zealand, I worked with Maori communities to develop protocols for handling traditional texts that had been removed from their ancestral lands by colonial collectors. In Peru, our methods were being used to recover Incan administrative records that had been written in quipu, the traditional knot-based writing system that European chroniclers had dismissed as primitive. In Ethiopia, we partnered with Orthodox monasteries to preserve illuminated manuscripts that contained the only surviving examples of ancient Ge'ez poetry. Each project reinforced my understanding that conservation work was ultimately about human dignity. When we recovered suppressed voices, preserved endangered artistic traditions, or helped communities reconnect with their ancestral knowledge, we were asserting that every culture had inherent value and deserved to survive into the future. The most personally meaningful project came when Father Augustine, now in his final years, contacted me about the old Mission Santa. I returned to the place where my spiritual understanding of conservation work had first crystallized, bringing with me a team of students from the Institute and advanced equipment that could handle the most delicate restoration challenges. Working in the mission's renovated library, surrounded by the same peaceful atmosphere that had once helped me understand my purpose, felt like completing a circle had begun with my grandmother's prayer book. Among the damaged documents, we discovered a collection of letters written by Native American converts to Christianity, describing their experiences of cultural transition and spiritual synthesis. The letters revealed the same kind of cultural blending I'd encountered in the California Manuscript Project, but from a more personal perspective. One letter particularly moved me, written by a young woman named Maria Esperanza, who described learning to read and write in Spanish while maintaining her traditional storytelling practices. "I write these words with the hand that once wove baskets," she had written, "but my heart still carries the songs my grandmother taught me. Perhaps someday my children will find ways to honor both the old path and the new one." Reading her words in the same mission where I'd first understood conservation as a form of prayer, I felt a profound connection across centuries to another woman who had navigated between cultures, finding ways to preserve what mattered while adapting to new realities. Her story reminded me that the work I dedicated my life to wasn't just about preserving the past, but about creating bridges that allowed cultural wisdom to flow into the future. As I worked on restoring Maria Esperanza's letters, Father Augustine visited the mission library every day, sitting quietly in a corner chair while I concentrated on the delicate process of stabilizing century-old paper and faded ink. His presence felt like a blessing on the work, a reminder of the spiritual dimension that had always guided my approach to conservation. One afternoon, as I carefully separated pages that had been stuck together by moisture damage, Father Augustine approached my workstation with the slow but determined movements of advanced age. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of 8 decades of faithful service, "I've been watching you work these past weeks, and I want you to know something. When I first met you at this mission 10 years ago, I saw a young woman searching for her purpose. Now I see someone who has become her purpose.
"You are exactly who God intended you to be." His words carried a finality that suggested he was saying goodbye, and indeed, Father Augustine passed away peacefully in his sleep just 2 weeks later. At his funeral, held in the same mission chapel where we'd first discussed the spiritual dimensions of manuscript restoration, I delivered a eulogy that was really a meditation on how mentors shape our understanding of calling. Father Augustine taught me that conservation work is fundamentally about love, I said, looking out over the congregation of people whose lives he'd touched. Love for beauty that deserves to survive. Love for voices that deserve to be heard. Love for the connections that bind human creativity across time and culture. He helped me understand that my technical skills were just tools in service of that larger love. After the funeral, I spent several hours alone in the mission chapel, sitting in the same pew where I'd first grappled with the decision to accept the Vatican's invitation. The circle felt complete in ways I couldn't have imagined when I was a heartbroken young woman seeking refuge from family disappointment and professional uncertainty. I thought about the journey that had brought me from feeling invisible at my brother's wedding to standing before the Nobel Committee as an advocate for cultural preservation. Every step had built on the previous one. Each challenge had prepared me for greater responsibilities. Each restored manuscript had deepened my understanding of why this work mattered. But more than personal achievement or professional recognition, I felt grateful for the opportunity to serve something larger than myself through work that felt like a continuous prayer. Every manuscript I restored, every voice I helped recover, every bridge I built between past and present was an offering to the idea that human creativity and cultural wisdom deserve to transcend the limitations of time and historical circumstance. As the sun set through the stained glass windows of the mission, casting colored light across the altar where I'd first understood my calling, I opened the journal I'd bought in Oslo and wrote a final entry about the completion of this particular chapter in my life's work. I began this journey as Elena Rodriguez, the invisible sister who felt overlooked and undervalued. I became the Cardinal through the recognition of others who saw potential I couldn't see in myself. But sitting here in this sacred space where my true understanding of conservation work was born, I realized that both of those identities were just steps toward becoming someone whose purpose transcends any single title or achievement. I am a guardian of human voices across time, a bridge between cultures separated by history, a servant of the beauty and wisdom that connects all people regardless of when or where they lived. This work will continue long after I'm gone, carried forward by students who will develop techniques I can't imagine, applied to discoveries that haven't been made yet, serving communities I'll never meet. But I know now that the work itself is eternal because the human impulse to create, to communicate, to connect across time and space is what makes us most fully human. Every manuscript we preserve, every voice we recover, every cultural bridge we build is an affirmation that love is stronger than time, that beauty transcends historical circumstance, and that no human voice should ever be permanently silenced. I closed the journal and walked out of the mission into the California evening, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, new opportunities to serve the calling that had shaped my entire adult life. But for tonight, I was simply grateful to be exactly who I was meant to be, doing exactly the work I was born to do, in service of something infinitely larger and more important than any individual achievement. The manuscript of my own life would continue to be written, but this chapter was complete. I was no longer becoming the Cardinal. I was the Cardinal, fully and completely, guardian of sacred voices, bridge between past and future, servant of the eternal human impulse to create beauty that transcends time itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.